All right, I want to welcome you to this. I guess it's a training video for the single board governance. I'm Jeff Pospisil, the Director of Finance with Kermit Culver, District Superintendent, and all-around good guy. Um, so I've had a number of churches ask me, what is this single board governance, or they call it sometimes one board or simple or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What is that, briefly, Kermit?
Yep. Well, it's a concept that it's a name that's been given to a concept of trying to simplify how churches are structured administratively. We have all inherited from years and years, centuries ago, really, this very elaborate committee structure that just gets passed down. In the 1950s and 60s, when the Methodist Church was at its heyday, every church was structured exactly the same. Every church had an administrative board and a council on ministries and a finance committee, on and on and on. And through the years, people are beginning to find that those structures are no longer very effective in providing administrative leadership for their own local church. And so they're looking for different models. And the discipline allows for churches to basically to administer themselves in ways that's effective. And so that's how it really came about. I was introduced to the concept before it had a name, back in the mid-90s, when after a couple of years here at Legacy, First Church then, and so we created a model that has worked for us, and they continue to use today at Legacy and some other places where we've shared it. So, yeah.
The very first church board I sat on was at Legacy or Bismarck First, and I thought that's how churches were organized. And then the next church board I sat on was organized very much the same. And then I started visiting some churches, and it blew me away when I saw the problems right away. But you alluded to that. Some of them's outdated. What are some of those problems that you experienced?
Well, let me give you an example. When I came to Bismarck First, the administrative council, I think it was called, was 32 people.
Yeah.
And it was the chairpersons of every organization within that congregation. So it was 32 people. They met every month for 2 hours. And so it was the head of the United Methodist Women, the United Methodist Men, the Youth Fellowship, the Missions Committee, Evangelism Committee, Worship Committee. And then it was all the standards, the finance, trustees, So anyway, and the 2 hours was basically a verbal newsletter. This is what we did last month. This is what we're working on this month. And this is what we're going to do next month. And they just gave reports. And occasionally, if they needed to spend more money or they wanted permission to raise money for some project or whatever, then they would have a vote. But otherwise, it was just this reporting. And I thought, this is a unfortunate misuse. I won't say a waste of time, but it was a misuse of people's time. We were spending 64 people hours every month at a newsletter, doing a newsletter. And I thought, there's got to be a better way. So we spent a year probably in the process of redesigning how we thought we were going to look and work and how it might work. And it was a good year. We had folks on, I put a reinventing team together. That's what I called it. And was representative of the church kind of across the spectrum. And we spent that year studying and reading books and studying from the scriptures and looking at how we best practice of how can we do our business better. And when we kind of got ready to adopt it, we gave it a job description, which I think is important for every organization, the part of the church. They kind of need to know how they fit with the greater vision of the church. So ours was conducting the business of First United Methodist Church in the most Christ-like manner. Period. We weren't doing with anything else. It was just the business of the church, and we were going to do it in a way that fit with the rest of the church. So that's kind of how we started, Jeff, was we realized what we were doing was expending a lot of people energy.
How hard was it to even recruit good people to want to serve in that situation?
Yeah. Yeah, it became, the nominating process became very interesting. The nominating committee is the only committee the pastor gets to chair. And I would offer a word of caution to pastors is don't ever give that away. Don't ever let somebody else take that job, because it's the key to making the church get the vision, to get on board. It's not that you need everybody on the nominating committee drinking your bathwater. It just means that you got to have people that are willing to see the mission and willing to move toward the mission. So, yeah, for us it was the recruitment was part of it. So the nominating process was the group would get together. They had these sheets. One sheet was everybody that was coming off one of these 32 committees, and the other sheet was all the slots that we needed to fill. And so it was just a matter of taking people coming off to put them in a different slot. And I thought, that I don't think that fits with the biblical understanding of spiritual gifting, and I don't think it was best utilizing people's gifts and their abilities. And furthermore, it was very interesting to me working in that process. One of the things I heard often in my early years is at First Church, we don't have any young people that want to be involved, and we need to get more young people involved. And so the second year I was there, I recruited a bunch of young people to be willing to be on the ballot for these committees. And we get to the nominating process, and I bring their names up, and they're like, well, they haven't been here long enough. They don't know how the church operates. And I'm like, wait a minute, you can't have both. You can't be saying we need a bunch of more young people, and then you won't let them work. I said, it's just not going to work. So part of it was just the challenge of recruiting people that had basically what I've discovered, and I think most people would agree with this, is that most lay people have about 2 hours a week that they can commit to something related to the church. So if that's worship for an hour and Sunday school for an hour, that's, sometimes it's some people have got more, but most people, particularly new people or young people coming into the faith, man, if you can get 2 hour commitment out of them, you're doing really well. So I think what's driving the conversation that I'm hearing in the conference right now is churches are just finding they've got less people in the pool with which to fill out all those forms for the charge conference, to fill out all those conference forms. And the first thing I would say is, don't worry about the forms. Nobody reads them. Don't tell the rest of the superintendents I said this, but nobody reads them anyway. But they just go in a file someplace. Anyway, I had a couple years ago, I had a pastor that had 4 churches in her parish, and she called me and she said, Kermit, I'm having fits trying to fill out all those forms, and I just don't know what I'm going to do. And I said, do you have 2 people in each of those 4 churches that will help you get the job done? They'll help you do the work. She goes, well, yeah, of course. I said, then put their names in all of them. I said, I don't care. Do what works. Figure out what works. So this is a model that we're going to talk about that worked for us. I'm not saying it's the model. I'm not saying it's a model that'll work everywhere, but I hope it gives people enough permission, number one, enough ideas, number two, to sort of to proceed in whatever model works for them.
Another thing I noticed, at least when I was working with some churches, is you get people that attendance was very sporadic at various meetings. So you'd have maybe 1 or 2 people that were in the know on the finance committee, and the rest of them were playing catch up. But yet they still had a full voice, even though they may have attended only 25% of the meetings. So they could still decide the future of your church, even though they're not fully engaged. So,
and you have to ask at that point if you got a committee of 8 and only 2 people show up, I think there's some question about the clarity of what the purpose of that group is. I mean, I've kind of always said this, Jeff. People don't get tired doing what they're passionate about.
Yeah.
And if they can somehow figure out what they're passionate about, and I'm not saying that you can throw away all or abandon all the committees. You got to have some structure to run the operation, but it can be very simple. And the model that we used back then and that's still being used here today, in many churches, is probably too complex. But it fulfills the requirement, and that, for the most part, at least, it gets the job done. So.